8:36. All right. Good morning, everyone. This is the February Local Equity Entrepreneur Program meeting. My name is Kristen Evidal. I'm the director of the County of Mendocino Cannabis Department. And with us today for our meeting, we have William Riley, who's the department's program administrator, and Trish Tracy, who is the department's staff assistant and responsible for, or the facilitator of, all things streamed and meeting formatting and meeting website page updating. So she keeps all of our ducks in a row, so to speak. And then we've also got with us today Ms. Paula Groves, who is the leadership for Elevate Impact and our fabulous contract administrators for this program. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our presentation for today. Paula, you want to kick us off and just hand it back over to me when you're ready?
Sure, absolutely. So welcome, everyone. It's good to see everyone on the call and actively participating. Today, we are going to cover the topics outlined on the agenda: the LEAP funding sources, the LEAP program statistics, the LEAP program update, and then we'll move to a Q&A. Do you want to give instructions for the Q&A now, or do you want to wait till the Q&A?
I'm happy to give instructions for the Q&A now. So please, everyone, you should note if you're using the Zoom platform, you do have access to the Q&A chat feature. So if you hover your cursor over your toolbar, you'll see a little kind of speech icon that says Q&A under it. At any time during the presentation today, you can click into that Q&A feature if you're using the Zoom app and type in a question or a comment that you might have. Those questions and comments come directly to panelists. So that's myself, William, Trish, and Paula would be able to see those questions and comments. Generally, we answer or respond to questions and comments orally at the end of the presentation. Sometimes we fold them into the presentation, depending on how many questions and comments come in during the presentation and whether or not the question or the comment that we see is relevant to the conversation we're having at the moment, right? So please, you can absolutely put questions and comments into the Q&A feature. There will be time for oral comments towards after the presentation today. And in order to get into the queue for oral comments, if you're on the Zoom app, you should use the raise hand feature, which is in the same toolbar where you'll find the Q&A feature. So raising your hand and someone already found it. We have our first person in the queue for oral comments. So the raise hand feature can also be accessed if you're not on the Zoom app and you're calling in from your phone by using *9. So *9 will raise your hand and lower your hand. When we do get to oral comments, we'll let you know kind of the top 3 in the queue. And when it's your turn to provide oral comment or ask a question, we'll ask you to unmute your device. You can unmute the Zoom platform using the mute microphone that you can find in your toolbar. It's generally in the left-hand side of your toolbar. And just clicking on that microphone will unmute you. Clicking on it again will remute you. And if you're calling in and asked to unmute because you're up for a question or comment, all you need to do is use *6 on your phone to unmute or remute yourself. So with that said, we'll do this whole reminder again as we go into comment, but I think this is a great way to participate in today's meeting. And I'll go ahead and turn the presentation back over to Ms. Paula Groves.
Thank you so much. So this slide outlines the sources of funding that we have received for the LEAP program. Line 1 shows the direct grants and workforce development funding that we got. We received $1.0 million in round 1, $565,000 in round 2, $1.9 million in round 3 for a combined funding amount of $3.563 million. Under the waiver program and state licensing / direct permit fees and direct grants, in round 1, we received $700,000. In round 2, we received $100,000. In round 3, we received $633,000 for a combined total amount of $1.433 million. With respect to technical assistance, which basically means technical training to equity applicants regarding licensing and operating in the cannabis industry, we received $224,000 in round 1. We received $83,000 in round 2, $294,000 in round 3 for a combined total amount of $602,000. Finally, in terms of administrative services, which includes county staff and outside consultants, we received $224,000 in round 1, $83,000 in round 2, $115,000 in round 3 for a combined total amount of $423,000.
All right. How about do you mind if I do this one?
Yeah.
Just okay. Thank you. So combined funding amounts, as Paula mentioned in the previous slide, were $5,321,293.14. Waivers and waiver amounts expended total $644,768.23 to date. And direct grants funded totals $2,604,573.06. So funding expended to date totals and just shy $3,250,000, right? So funding remaining. Currently, there's over $2 million in funding remaining. However, $874,000 and some odd change is encumbered. And it's encumbered meaning that we have approved grants that are in the county review process. They've been either entered into Cobblestone and are working through the Cobblestone system, or they've made it through Cobblestone and the auditor is processing them in preparation for check issuance, or they're in that final stage of check issuance processing. So again, encumbered funding that's in the county review queue totals $874,426.56. So that's where we are today in funding. PBS fee waiver update. PBS fee waivers must now be sent to the Cannabis Department. We are requesting that folks try to remember to utilize our new email address for all things grant related, cannabisgrants@mendocinocounty.org. But rest assured, if you send your waiver to mcdpod@mendocinocounty.org or cannabis program at mendocinocounty.org, it's still going to get to us, and we'll just sort it into the appropriate mailbox manually. But we are, again, trying to get folks to utilize the Cannabis Grants email address that we just developed for all things cannabis grant related, whether it's a LEAP question or an LJAGP question. This really is going to be the best way to get cannabis grant information, because we'll be staffing it with folks who can respond to your grant questions. Once we've received the PBS fee waiver, department staff will review the scope of that fee waiver. And then upon approval, staff will go ahead and send that PBS fee waiver over to Planning and Building Services, aka PBS, where they'll complete the estimate portion of that waiver, send it back to us, and then we'll continue the processing just like we would if you had sent it directly over. So just a new starting point for PBS fee waivers is that they should come to the cannabis department. We'll do our thing, and then we'll get those PBS fee waivers over to Planning and Building Services so they can provide the estimate and complete that portion of the process. All right, some information about the round 4 solicitation. So as many of you know, we did apply for a 4th round of funding in late 2022. We were not awarded that 4th round of funding due to concerns about the county's eligibility criteria. So I know there's been some messaging out there that the reason why we didn't get round 4 funding was because of the timelines it took us to spend on the funds. William and I spent some time with GoBiz and the staff from GoBiz who actually reviewed the applications, and there was no reference or mention to the funding timeline or the spend down timeline being a component of our low score, which is what resulted in us not getting a 4th round of funding. What was emphasized during that meeting was solely the eligibility criteria and the fact that the equity program is meant to benefit individuals that were directly impacted by the war on drugs. And so what was emphasized in the conversation by GoBiz staff is that they have criteria concerns, not about being impacted by camp rates, but how the county was unable to show that a 5-mile radius of a camp raid resulted in a direct impact to the individual who was within 5 miles of that camp raid. So, for example, we didn't have, and we don't have, statistics or data to back up that there's a direct impact to an individual who lived within 5 miles of a camp raid. But again, I want to emphasize that there was no concern expressed about the direct impacts of a camp raid. The concern was about how we could justify that there was a direct impact to someone within 5 miles of that camp raid. Going forward, we'll be adding to the camp raid criteria, so to speak, a requirement that folks are going to have to tell their story about how they were directly impacted by the camp raid experience that occurred at their home, right? So we are going to have to kind of narrow our criteria in order to be eligible for a 5th round of funding, right? So, or to apply for round 5 of funding. Additional concern was expressed by GoBiz staff around the parent, sibling, child arrest and conviction criteria. They have asked us to, in some ways, kind of beef that criteria up to ensure that it was a direct impact to the individual applying for equity eligibility. So kind of an example of how a parent, sibling, or child arrest and conviction may or may not be a direct impact is if my situation, right? I have a sibling who was arrested after we were both in college, out of the home, living on opposite sides of the country, right? So my sibling was pulled over, had an ounce of cannabis on her, was arrested for that ounce of cannabis and had to do a 60 or 90-day stint in local jail. Now, that really doesn't result in a direct impact to me because here we are out of the house, right? We don't live together. We're on opposite sides of the country. And while I was concerned for her well-being, right, and I could, and I counseled her or listened to her and held space about the stress that she was going through, that wouldn't have qualified me as being directly impacted by the war on drugs. Now, if my sibling and I, say, shared a home together and the home was raided because my sibling had a search warrant issued on the home due to some sort of cannabis-related activity, and she was subject to arrest and potentially conviction, the fact that our home was raided, right, would result in a direct impact. So we really have to do a better job in our eligibility criteria to ensure that every individual we certify can show a direct impact from the war on drugs. So in order to try to help make the criteria a little more suitable for what the state is looking for, we are working directly with GoBiz staff to ensure that the future eligibility, to ensure that we are in the future eligible for local jurisdiction equity grant funding. And really, again, I know folks have been really wanting us to expand the definition of camp so that there's an ability for eligibility if you live within 5 miles of a search warrant executed by one or more agencies that have traditionally been involved in Campaign Against Marijuana Planting program. The state was really opposed to that. They had extreme concerns that that type of expansive criteria in the program would essentially qualify just about all individuals in the county. And again, GoBiz staff placed a tremendous amount of emphasis on the criteria for this program being really solely for individuals that were directly impacted by the war on drugs. So one of the best ways we can move forward with a Campaign Against Marijuana Planting raid or camp raid criteria is going to be to have the individual utilizing that as a criteria for eligibility explain by telling their story about how they were impacted by the Campaign Against Marijuana Planting. And I think the same is going to be true for parent, sibling, child arrest and conviction criteria, right? It's going to be important and placed upon the individual utilizing a parent arrest or conviction, a sibling arrest or conviction, a child's arrest or conviction, to really clearly explain how that arrest or conviction directly impacted the individual applying for equity eligibility. If we do not kind of tighten up our criteria, we will not be eligible for additional funding in the future. And I think as the state has executed this program and moved it forward, and then there's more jurisdictions coming online seeking equity funds, they've really been moving towards making sure that not just in Mendocino County, but in all jurisdictions operating a local equity program, that those deemed eligible by that local jurisdiction were truly directly impacted by the war on drugs. So this isn't just a conversation that's happening between GoBiz and Mendocino County. This is a conversation that's happening between GoBiz and all local jurisdictions seeking funds and or seeking repeated funding awards. So I know that this not only impacted our direct grant, but other jurisdictions who applied for grant funding in this last round of solicitation. So with that said, I don't know, Paula or William, if either of you wants to add to this conversation, I would welcome it.
Yeah, absolutely, Kristen. The clearest understanding that I got from the meeting that we had with the state was simply that once we pitched the idea of expanding the criteria to any 5-mile qualifying arrest, the state expressed to us that they were concerned that the criteria that we were offering in our program created a general assistance program, not a program based upon established impacted eligibility. And the easiest way for me to think about that is my past working in EFIS. We have a general assistance program, we have an eligibility program. And when the state said that, it made clear sense, because if we expanded it to 5-mile radius of any potential impact, they were concerned that could encompass 95% of the county populace.
Thanks for that, William. Paula, you want to add to it as well?
Yes, I think going forward, I just want to emphasize something that Kristen said, which is, you have to tell your story. You have to really put into words how you were specifically impacted by a camp raid. And then based upon that, we have developed a form that you can use to write down your story. And then we will ask you for where the raid occurred. That's very important. What article references the raid, and then how you specifically were impacted. And again, if you were impacted because of a familial arrest, again, tell in your story how that arrest impacted you. We're going to require that you write down on the form your story. And I think this is going to be very important for qualifying people under the eligibility criteria. I saw a lot of questions in the Q&A about why is the eligibility, what do you need to do to get an eligibility letter and what is the process? Well, this is the new process. And the eligibility letter issuances have definitely slowed down as we have been in conversations with the state about what their criteria, how they want us to revise the Mendocino criteria. So please, be willing to tell your story. And I just want to reflect on that point just a little bit. It was a very traumatizing time in Mendocino County. And so, some people may find it difficult to tell their story because it is so traumatizing. And I don't want this to be a traumatizing process for people. But I think if you share this type of information with the state, and if you share your story, people will really have a much better appreciation about how Mendocino County specifically was impacted by the war on drugs, which was different than the urban areas. Well, we just need to let people know that life in Mendocino County was very different and it was very traumatizing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. So let's go ahead and let's see here. Let's do some Q&A. We've got an hour to have discussion and go through question and answers. I do think, oops, my apologies. Just lost my main screen. Give me just a minute here. Let me go to the end. Apologize. Okay.
Do you want me to read the questions out loud, Kristen?
I was going to look and see if we could group some of these together. So let's talk a little bit, let's try to answer some questions that came up in the chat in the Q&A feature, specific to the lack of funding or the lack of award for round 4. Yeah. So will the MCD be providing any materials that were provided to the county related to the lack of award for public review? So currently the MCD has not been provided anything in writing about why we were not awarded. The conversation that William and I had with GoBiz was that it was a conversation. We did a Zoom meeting where we met with the deputy director and one of the grant analysts. and specifically with the grant analyst who helped score the applications that were recently awarded in 2023, submitted in 2022 and awarded in 2023. So there's not currently anything in writing for us to share. However, we will be providing this update in the report that will go to the General Government Committee in February. So there will be that piece. This may have been answered in another Q&A, but can you speak to why CAMP versus other rates or other criteria efforts as the benchmark? So just to be clear, direct impacts that were the result of a CAMP rate is a qualifying criteria, but also direct impacts that were the result of a search warrant executed, right, on your home, arrest, like if you were arrested for cannabis-related charges, those impacts also are qualifiers. And I would encourage folks who have questions about the qualifying criteria to visit the elevateimpactmendo.com website, look at the eligibility criteria. You've got to go to the header, and then there's an eligibility criteria page that you can link into from there. And that will give you a list of criteria. The really important thing to remember is that with all of the criteria listed, you must be able to show that you were directly impacted by the war on drugs.
And can I just speak to that? We've gotten a lot of people, for example, who have submitted a search warrant by their neighbor's house who lived 2 miles away, received a search warrant. And they've used that search warrant to try to qualify themselves as an individual. The problem is the gap in providing that information is, how did a search warrant on your neighbor who lived 2 miles away impact you? That's what we need you to explain in your submission of that search warrant.
Right. And I know that there's concerns. I want to just acknowledge concerns about asking victims of, victims who were impacted by the war on drugs to relive that trauma. Without telling your story, I don't know how we assure that we're awarding funds to individuals who are directly impacted. So I definitely am sympathetic that it can be traumatic to tell your story. It can result in kind of a reliving of that trauma. But without, say, statistical data showing that there is an impact if you were within 5 miles of a raid or a camp raid, right, without being able to show that you were directly impacted by a sibling being arrested, without statistical data to back that up, I think the only way to proceed is to have the applicant really tell their story about what the impact was that they experienced. So I just want to acknowledge that it can result in reliving trauma, but without empirical data to back up the criteria we have in place, I don't think we have another pathway forward, unfortunately.
And if you have a personal arrest, yes, that counts. If your name is on the arrest record and you can demonstrate that you were arrested, yes, that qualifies you for the program.
So I know that folks think it's effing BS, right? That we were denied about based on the eligibility criteria, and that there really has been some county-wide trauma due to the war on drugs, especially camp and heavy raids in the area. This was clearly discussed. William and I discussed this with GoBiz, and the response we're getting from GoBiz is, if you're going to be eligible for another round of funding, you must be able to show that those deemed eligible were directly impacted by the war on drugs. So this idea that there's a county-wide trauma is not going to be a robust enough criteria for GoBiz to award us another round of funding. And I'll come right there to you, William, because I just want to say one more thing here. When we look at broad and expansive criteria, such as what's being suggested, that there is a county-wide traumatic impact, it is perceived by the state that the program is not exclusively assisting those parties that were directly impacted by the war on drugs, but instead that we were operating an economic development program. And this is not an economic development grant program. It really is meant to assist solely those individuals directly impacted by the war on drugs. So William, please.
Well, I wanted to share a little bit, because Kristen is often sharing her personal experience, which clearly indicates that, some people have been subject to the trauma of the war on drugs. And I think that me being silent on this for so long has created kind of this concern. But I'm 35 years old, and I was born in Mendocino County, and I've lived here my entire life aside from going to college. I have never seen Black Hawk helicopters dropping people out of their fuselages to cut down marijuana plants. I have never seen the impact of war on drugs growing up in Redwood Valley. And while I completely respect the trauma that people have, it's not necessarily a county-wide impact, and the state recognizes that as well.
Yeah, so thank you for that, William. I really appreciate it. And, some questions about DCC using zip codes to qualify folks for equity waivers. That is what they're doing right now. That program is separate from the GoBiz program and what's in statute. So I think they can have some different criteria and eligibility opportunities. And so the DCC program for equity licensing fee waivers, again, I just want to emphasize, is a completely separate program than the local jurisdiction equity grant funding program hosted by GoBiz. So they can have separate and differing criteria. The state agencies can use separate and differing criteria. So question about who designated the 5-mile radius of a camp raid and the parent, sibling, child arrest conviction criteria, the county or the state. These were county criteria, or criteria developed by the county, I should say. And they were then folded into the original program manual, which hasn't changed. Like the criteria component of the program manual has not changed to date. So this was a county developed 5-mile radius component. It was a county developed sibling child arrest, parent sibling child arrest conviction criteria component. And while the state's definitely not telling us that we can't use a camp raid as criteria and that we can't use, or that we can't use parent, sibling, child arrest conviction, they are telling us that we have to ensure that the impacts of the camp raid was a direct impact, the impacts of a parent, sibling, child arrest or conviction was a direct impact to the applicant applying for eligibility criteria. What about narrowing the 5-mile radius, but broadening the law enforcement agency's eradication efforts? It is a solid no from the state to allow anyone within any type of radius of an executed search warrant to be provided eligibility criteria. So whether I'm next door to an executed search warrant or 5 miles away from an executed search warrant, it's still a no from GoBiz. It would not qualify as a direct impact unless I was the individual subject to the search warrant activity.
And can I ask a sub question to that? Will the state allow something other than a camp raid, like a comet raid?
Well, I mean, it still would have to be a direct impact, right? So I think, the 5-mile radius isn't going to work in any instances. And I don't think a 1-mile radius is going to work in any instance, right? It's really how were you as an applicant for the eligibility program, how were you directly impacted? And that's what we need to show. And that's what we're going to need to be able to show to the state if and when we get audited, which I imagine all of these programs at some point or another, right, are audited. So in order for us to be eligible for funding in the future, we're going to have to beef up the criteria to ensure that we are only awarding program funding and equity program benefits to individuals directly impacted.
Thank you.
Now, did GoBiz approve the original proposal? I don't really know the answer to this because I was not with the county when the original manual was provided. So I don't know what steps the county took to have that manual reviewed. But indirectly, right, the county's been awarded funds a number of times, which leads one to believe that the criteria was appropriately scoped. However, I just want to remind folks that just like the counties and local jurisdictions setting up these programs and kind of going through the growing pains of getting these programs off the ground, the state is very much so in the same position, right? They're trying to get these programs up and running, the local jurisdiction equity grant program up and running, get the funding out the door to the local jurisdictions who have qualified so that they can get it into the hands of those disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And as the more and more jurisdictions have established local equity programs, and again, equity program, the local jurisdiction equity program is funded by a combination of annually allocated funds from the general fund and cannabis tax dollars. And I think as cannabis tax dollars are reduced, the state is experiencing limited funding with more jurisdictions to support and really having to look at that eligibility criteria to ensure that they are truly awarding funds to local jurisdictions that can show that the funding they're providing to applicants is really going to applicants that were directly impacted by the war on drugs. So this is not just a conversation between Mendocino County and GoBiz, but GoBiz and all local jurisdictions seeking local equity grant funding to support their local equity programs. So I think we've talked about pretty broadly concerns that legacy operators were widely affected and that there may be a cultural and county-wide traumatic impact from the way camp was executed in the county. But again, the state needs it to be more specific and for local jurisdictions to be able to quantify the direct impact to the individual. So we have an attendee who was a school counselor during the camp raid periods and the impacts of helicopters flying over elementary schools and playgrounds and driving through town with cannabis hanging off trucks and out of baskets hanging from helicopters and from helicopters landing in fields with men holding rifles. Again, if you were directly impacted by any of those activities, you could tell your story and qualify for camp raid, right? But if you can't show that those camp raids directly impacted you, we aren't going to be able to qualify you for LEAP eligibility. A great question here about whether or not the eligibility criteria change. Is it going to impact the direct grant requests that have already been submitted? We have not been asked to revoke any criterias issued, so to speak, and we do not intend to revoke criterias issued, right? So what we're focused on now is clarifying the criteria and putting some processes in place so that going forward, we can rest assured, show the state that we are awarding funds to individuals that were directly impacted. If you've accepted or received grant funds, will you need to fill out the forms? And I'm assuming that this is a question about filling out the forms to tell your story about your impact. It's a great question that I can't say we've had any internal discussion about to date. And so I don't really have an answer. But I think it's a good question for staff and our contract administrators to somewhat put a pin in, so to speak, right? And look at whether or not we should have folks go back and tell their stories so we have that paperwork available. But we have not discussed that internally yet. Direct story correlation letter makes sense, but restricting it to only camp does not really make sense when multiple departments terrorized our county. Again, I think it's probably going to be more challenging to show that your neighbor having a search warrant executed created a direct impact to you, right? That's going to be really hard for us to get approval for by the state. And the state is really focused on direct impact. So I wouldn't say that it's the department's effort to restrict it to only camp, but based on the guidance we're receiving, we feel very much so that we have to restrict this direct impact storytelling component to camp, also to the sibling, child, parent, conviction or arrest component. We really have to ensure, again, that we are showing that it was a direct impact.
And a sub question to that, Kristen, I think that it's important to maybe explain the difference between the camp raid being open field and the other raids which involved search warrants. I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, so Campaign Against Marijuana Planting, or the CAMP program, did use open field search warrants, which do not allow officers to enter a curtilage, right? The curtilage being the usable portion of your land what the used portion of your land is what I should say. So like where your immediate activities are on that property, your home, your veggie garden, your chickens, right? Like the immediate area that you utilize that can be identified as an immediately utilized area around the residence is what's considered curtilage. So Campaign Against Marijuana Planting had broad law enforcement terror impacts in the sense that they generally targeted a neighborhood or a segment of a neighborhood or watershed. They put law enforcement on the ground to work with the helicopter or helicopters in the air. The helicopters flew low, very low, around folks' homes and in the wilderness spaces between residents in search of cannabis that had been planted, and then directed ground crews, law enforcement ground crews, to eradicate those plants that were outside of individual curtilages, right? An executed search warrant or a search warrant is developed to conduct a search of a specified premise, right? So generally that is a curtilage, a property that's named, a set of structures on a property that's shared that are named, right? So an executed search warrant is a really different dynamic and scenario than how the CAMP program was put into place. And again, if you were the victim of a search warrant, it was executed at your home or your place of business, right? In relationship to cannabis, that is a qualifying criteria right there, that you were present when a search warrant was executed, right, at your home or your place of work, perhaps. So that is a direct impact and a qualifying criteria. But this open field search activity that was conducted by Campaign Against Marijuana Planting, you would have to really show that you were subject or directly impacted by that open field search program.
Thank you.
We haven't decided if we're removing the 5 mile radius. This is a broader conversation. It's likely we will remove the radius, but I can't say that we've completed our analysis of how to ensure that the criteria meets the state requirements. And so what we'll be doing is looking at the criteria, doing a deep dive into it, putting together some proposals, and then running them through GoBiz to make sure that they don't have any concerns about revamped criteria, so to speak. So again, we will not be revoking criteria or certifications that we've already issued. I just want to make that really clear. This is how do we move forward? And yes, an individual would be eligible if they can show that they were rated by city police, the sheriff's department, the DEA, the FBI, or another governmental agency for a cannabis related issue. Okay, so I think we've spent a good 20 minutes kind of going through a lot of these questions. There's a lot of kind of repeat questions that we're seeing in the Q&A. So I think at this time, it might be wise, we've got a lot of hands raised, to take some callers and run through some of those questions. We can always go back to Q&A if there's still time. So let me go ahead and prepare for some oral comments. So again, if you want to ask a question orally or provide a comment orally, we do ask that you raise your hand so that we can identify you in the Q&A queue or in the oral question and comment queue. To raise your hand, if you're utilizing the Zoom app, you'll look at the toolbar. You might have to click on the 3 dots that say more underneath it to get the hand raised feature, but you can do that right on your Zoom app. If you're calling in today and not on the Zoom app, you can raise your hand by using *9. So with that said, we've got the first 3 individuals in our queue is a caller identified as Nicole, who will be followed by a caller identified as 8120. And then third in the queue is Monique Ramirez. So what we're going to go ahead and do is provide Nicole an opportunity to unmute herself. So Nicole, you should be able to go ahead and unmute yourself and start your question or your comment. You have 2 minutes.
All right. Thank you guys for the meeting. Just want to start out by saying that. And then also, I've just realized through this meeting that they've changed the policy on the planning and building for the fee waiver. Is there any way to get some type of, or did we get some type of email letting us know about that? The only reason I'm asking is I went down to building and planning yesterday. I already shot over Willits, and it was like, oh, you need to go to cannabis first. And because of the geographics in the county buildings, it's really important to communicate with us farmers who live 2.5 hours out of the county's city limits to, facilitate what they need to be doing. I went down to do some cannabis stuff, and I was just curious if there was a notification about that new policy and where we would get the information if there wasn't a notification about these new policies that come out for the fee waiver. And last question, which maybe be in the future, we've talked about eligibility. What if we are eligible? We have a number. We've gotten past that. I've had a number since 2020, and I've yet to receive grant funding. And I don't know what I need to personally do to get past that hurdle because I was directly affected. I have an arrest warrant in my packet showing my name on the arrest warrant, the incarceration, the whole bit. So just curious on what it takes when you are qualified to actually get the grant funding. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Paula, you came back on. Did you want to start with the response and then?
So taking things in reverse order. So once you get your eligibility number, you are required to submit a grant proposal, which includes very specific information about how you're going to actually spend the money. So you have to develop a scope of work. You have to submit information regarding your AG permit. You have to also provide a very detailed budget, and you have to provide estimates and quotes that are associated with your budget line items. Things that have slowed down, and then once you submit all that information, you have to go through the budget approval process. Things that have slowed down the budget approval process include folks that have not given us quotes and estimates that reflect the line items on their budgets. People who have requested for funds to be reimbursed. And unfortunately, the state does not allow expense reimbursement. It has to be for expenses that are projected in the future. We've had people submit permits where their name was not actually on the permit. The permit was actually issued to maybe somebody they worked with, but the permit has to be in your name or in your business name. So these are examples of what has slowed down the grant approval process. If you have a specific question about what has slowed down your process, and I know that people say that Elevate takes a long time to get back to them, and I apologize for that, but we've now set up a new customer help desk. So if you have questions about what is taking your grant approval process, what has delayed it, please send me an email to support@elevateimpactfunds.com, and I will research where you stand in the process. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. So we will put an update on the website regarding the fee waiver. So in the fee waiver section, we'll make sure that it's clear that all fee waivers now come to the cannabis department first. The planning and building services fee waiver was the only fee waiver that went directly to an agency other than the Mendocino Cannabis Department. So we can, I think, put some quick language in the fee waiver section on the website to be sure to email or deliver, right, your waiver or waivers to the cannabis department. And we could also send that update out via CanaNote. So we would be happy to do that. We'll have another CanaNote coming out Tuesday morning, I anticipate. Okay, I think we managed those questions. I think we can go to our next caller, which is going to be caller identified as 8120. Then we'll hear from Monique Ramirez and then Heidi Birdhouse. So caller ending in 8120, you should be able to unmute your phone using *6 and begin your comments or questions.
Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Susan, and thank you very much for this update. A couple of questions. For families who go way back, those people were in a situation, I believe the DA was someone named Eister. It was basically a pay to play. So if you had the pay, you could play and charges were dismissed. This was countywide. Secondarily, there's a real concern about being able to provide documentable records. we've had the experience, and our colleagues have had the experience of trying to get actual records, say from the sheriff's department, local law enforcement, etc. And because addresses were not printed in our local paper, and because of privacy or the allegation that privacy was being protected, it's virtually impossible to get actual records. So deferring to Paula and Kristen and the impetus, to write a very detailed story about what happened, many of us are really loath to do that because, it's really painful. It's horrible. I won't go into some of the things that happened. They were ugly. They were sexist. And to do that and then find out that, well, this is, moving, but we need actual paperwork. And we're just not able to get those kinds of things. So from your experience working with the state, Paula and Kristen, what is your suggestion? Because it sort of feels like a lot of us are stuck between a rock and a hard place here. Thank you very much.
Thanks for those comments, Susan. And the trauma is real from experiencing camp. I moved to the county in Humboldt County, Southern Humboldt, in 1996, and camp was traumatizing. That was my experience. I felt completely traumatized by experiencing camp year after year after year. And so it does bring stuff up when you write about it. Again, we don't have all the answers here today. So, as we mentioned earlier, we are working directly with GoBiz to ensure that changes to the criteria meet the state's expectations. And when we did talk to GoBiz, William and I had our meeting with GoBiz recently. I talked about the storytelling piece and how it may be one of the only ways to actually ensure that the camp rate activity cited, say, in an article, right, directly impacted the individual applying for equity eligibility criteria. I think I would like to encourage folks, if you have suggestions about how to beef up that campaign against marijuana planting criteria, to please email those suggestions to cannabisgrants@mendocinocounty.org. We really are sympathetic and do not in any way, shape, or form want to re-trigger individuals' trauma. But we also want to ensure that the camp raid criteria can be utilized, right? So how we do that is a little tricky because of the nature of Campaign Against Marijuana Planting. There not being search warrant records for that program. We are open to suggestions. And again, this is going to take us some time to really work with the state and members of the public to ensure that the criteria changes we need to make are acceptable to the state so that we can be eligible for funding in the future. I don't know, William or Paula, if you would like to add to that.
I think if you are willing, and I know that it is traumatizing, if you are willing to tell your story, if we get a collection of these stories that we can then share with the state, I think it will go a long way towards convincing them that this is a appropriate criteria. So for those of you who can share your story and are willing to share your story, I think that we, will get your permission, of course, to share those stories with the state. And I think it would go a long way. So please, if you have the experience and are willing to write it down, it would help the county immensely.
It would help the county, and not necessarily in qualifying for the grant, but this grant is a competitive grant in the fact that it's only a limited amount of money that the state is giving out. And so they have to choose how to divide that money amongst all of the counties that apply who are awarded. And so those stories strengthen the amount of funding that we can receive once if we're decided to be an awarded county. And so in preparing for round 5, having those stories will actually give us a better chance at getting more funding for our county.
I agree with all those points. Thank you for adding those in. Next, we'll hear from Monique Ramirez, followed by Heidi Werthaus, and then Chantal Simone Pietri. So, Monique, you should be able to go ahead and unmute your device and begin your comment or question.
Thank you. First off, I'd like to find out when the county is going to be able to apply for round 5 funding. I'd like to know how much direct grant funds are available at this time. And I also want to know if the county is still going to honor prioritizing the low income applicants that first applied in this program, especially now that this funding is going to run out sooner than we thought. I'm also curious about how this is going to work for the people that have already submitted documents. They are eligible and they're in the new portal. As the money gets exhausted, is everything just going to shut down? And I'm waiting for the answer, obviously, for how long till we can see more funding. But if it's a year plus out, just curious how you guys are going to tackle that. Feels like such a huge loss to our community, honestly. It makes me want to cry for all the applicants that have thought of this as a lifeline that are now probably not going to be able to move forward with their businesses, quite honestly. And also, I just want to point to the fact that I have asked this many times about the direct funding and just the funding in general being there for applicants, because we had so many apply and the numbers never added up. And you very clearly have stated, like, not to worry. We would always, we have no reason to believe we won't get funded for the next round. And then look, here we are. So let's take this as a huge lesson to never make assumptions on anything. It's one of the golden rules of life. And I really think that we need to honor that because we set people's hopes up and look what happens when it doesn't work out. I also want to say that I feel like we should have always created some type of point system that prioritized the impacts for people. That way everyone could be eligible, but those that have had larger impacts than others, could receive more funding or whatever, just be prioritized in a different way, but to exclude everyone.
All right, time was reached and I apologize. We've got a lot of hands raised to try to get through. So we're gonna have to stick to the 2 minutes. When is the county eligible to apply for funding? In the fall of 2023, we'll be eligible when they open up the next solicitation process, which is usually like October-ish, right? When they open it. So we can kind of look forward to an October or November opportunity to apply again. How much funding is available is really clearly spelled out in the slideshow. So if we go back to the presentation, right here, there is $2,071,952.05 remaining in funding that can be utilized for waivers and direct grants. And then we do have $874,426.56 of funds encumbered. And what we mean by encumbered is that that 874,000 and change has not been spent, but it is associated with grant agreements that the department has approved, that the department has entered into Cobblestone for processing. So the $874,000 in change does represent agreements that are in process either in the Cobblestone platform or they've been through Cobblestone and the auditor is processing their vendor account, or they've been through Cobblestone and have their vendor account processing and they're awaiting the check to be issued, right? So this is a direct accounting from the auditor's office. So this is what's left in the pool. I appreciate the suggestion for a point system. I think that's something we can consider. We do need to revamp this program. And as far as prioritizing those that are low income, at this point, we are not gathering tax information because all of the income thresholds were eliminated. So that's where we're at with that. I don't know, Paula or William, if you wanted to add to any of that.
I think that everything that you said is absolutely appropriate. I do think that we should look at ways in which to improve the program. And I really appreciate this suggestion about the point system. And I think if other people have suggestions that they should email them to us, you can email me at, Elevate Impact, you can email the staff. But I think that when we apply for the funds in October, we should have have reviewed all of these comments and suggestions, and by October, really put forth recommendations on how to improve the program.
Agreed. Thank you for that. We'll next hear from Heidi Wordhouse, followed by Chantal Simone Pietri, and then Tamara Kislak. So Heidi, you should be able to unmute your device and start your question or comment.
Thank you very much for this conversation today. As we know, grants are made up of many different criteria, and what I've heard today is mostly talking about one set of criteria. And when I hear it, what I'm hearing is a weaponization of that criteria against applicants and even the state, the person who is funded, the group that is funding this. And I'm finding that a little concerning, that I haven't heard what Mendocino County itself is going to do to change the formatting, change the information for upcoming applications. Like when you applied this year, did you simply send in a copy of last year's? Was it significantly different? Did you share the information on what was getting funded and the impacts that was making in people's life? Because that's one of the things funders really look for. And I'm not hearing that information here in your presentation today. And secondly, one of the criteria for the grant is incorporating applicant feedback into the local grant program, showing how you're taking that feedback, making changes to make the funding more accessible to applicants, not less accessible, but more accessible to applicants, and how that feedback is affecting the program. So I'm curious what Mendocino entered into the grant application about how you incorporate that feedback and how the state felt about it, about the information that Mendocino was sharing. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that. So, the biggest feedback or the strongest feedback we got from the state was really that the grant application itself was not robust enough in explaining how the county was ensuring that those receiving the benefits of the LEAP program were directly impacted by the war on drugs. That was like the number one piece. And then that does go through kind of include threads into other questions. Because if we can't show, for example, that all of our equity eligible applicants were directly impacted by the war on drugs, it makes it equally hard to show how the equity program benefited those directly impacted by the war on drugs, right? So that's kind of a chicken or the egg scenario where when the state questioned the criteria, it drew additional questions about how we were able to show that the program was specific to assisting and in what ways it was specific to assisting those that were directly impacted by the war on drugs. Now, the entire grant solicitation packet and what we submitted can be found on the Board of Supervisors attachments. So in order for us to apply to the state for direct grant funding, we had to bring the grant application to, I believe we first went to General Government Committee, and then it went on to the consent calendar for the board. So I do believe that this is part of the November General Government Committee meeting, but you could look back in October or November of the board meetings and the General Government Committee to find the entire solicitation packet that we submitted. I would like to note that this is the first year that when we submitted the grant packet, we also were required to submit the assessment, right? So last year we submitted the grant application packet we were not required to submit an assessment. So this year, the state did add the requirement for all jurisdictions to submit the assessment that was conducted. And again, I think this speaks directly to the state's actions to narrow local jurisdiction criteria so that the state can ensure that the funds they're passing through to these local jurisdictions are benefiting individuals directly impacted by the war on drugs. And as I mentioned, what's the county going to do about the criteria information? William and I just had this conversation with the state last week. So, it's new. And we are going to continue to work with the state to ensure that any changes to the criteria are suitable to the state, right? And that they meet the state's requirements for eligibility criteria. And again, we won't be applying until the fall of 2023 when the next round of solicitation opportunities are available to local jurisdictions. So we have some time to work with the state and the public and the supervisors to ensure that our criteria is robust enough to allow us to be awarded a 5th round or another round of funding. Paula, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think that we have an opportunity to definitely collect additional feedback as we're going through what we want to propose in October. And you can definitely send us emails, but I'll work with Kristen and William to see if there's a formal way for us to get your feedback, and so that we can incorporate it into whatever we decide or the county decides is the appropriate proposal to submit to the state. Maybe we have some sort of a survey or an open forum where we can receive those sorts of suggestions. But I think that there's an opportunity to get the community input into whatever we propose to the state to make sure that people are heard.
And I do want to just remind folks that community input, right, through these very meetings is how we got to the place of expanding the manual to allow for tax waivers. It's how we got to the place of expanding the manual to remove the requirement around replacing a combustion engine for solar development, right? So there's a number of instances where feedback from the community has directly resulted in expanding the award opportunities for those deemed eligible. So, again, I encourage folks, if you have questions about the grant solicitation, you can find it in the fall meeting agenda for the Board of Supervisors and the General Government Committee. William, do you want to add anything to this conversation? Okay. We will next go to Chantal, followed by Tamara Kislak, and then Paul Hansberry. Chantal, you should be able to go ahead and unmute your device and start your questions or comments.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Great, thank you so much. I have about 7 points and questions. The first one is for folks that were previously denied eligibility prior to the new requirement of the story document, will they be eligible or able to resubmit? The second one is getting into the numerics of the $2 million number that is shown on the table that you just showed. Is the 874 that is encumbered included in that 2 million or separate? And if it is included, then if you do the math, 2 million minus roughly 900,000, then there's 1.1 million remaining to distribute. Divided by 80K, that results in 13 applications that have not yet been funded, being able to receive funding until the next round of the 5th round is approved. Could you please confirm that? That also steps into the, could you explain the current status as far as our applications still being accepted? The next point is, can you please share the link to where GoBiz defines direct impact in the correlated to this manner of a funding program related to the war on drugs. And a point of concern that while I appreciate Mr. Riley's comments of his own history of being raised in Redwood Valley and never having seen a helicopter, that is an extreme concern to me to hear that this is the person who is in dialogue with Go Business and essentially in the role of an advocate for the county program. I'm going to go fast by the next one. What's the estimated current timeline for processing of eligibility and also budget submissions? Please.
Okay, and time was reached. So, okay. Folks who've been denied eligibility can certainly reapply, right? There's nothing stopping folks from reapplying for eligibility and perhaps, beefing up that application a bit. So definitely there's no restriction on reapplying, just so everyone knows. The numbers of the 2 million available and the 874,000 encumbered, the 874,000 and change has not been subtracted from the $2 million. It is encumbered. And the reason why we've listed it as encumbered is because there are occasions where as direct grant agreements move through the county's internal processing system, that the numbers change or a scope of project has to be removed or something different is added on. So it's encumbered and it's not expended. Currently, our application is still being accepted. I'm going to kick that one to Paula. You want to respond to that one, Paula?
Sure. Eligibility applications are still being accepted. Grant applications closed on January 7th.
Great. So, we can share the link to Business and Profession Code, but you could also go on to Ledge Info. And what GoBiz is using as the framework for how they execute the program with local jurisdictions is in Business and Profession Code. So, it's their interpretation of statute. So, and then Paula, any insights on timeline for eligibility processing?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier in this discussion, eligibility processing has slowed down as we've been getting feedback from the state. And so now that we have much clearer feedback that Kristen has shared with you on this presentation, we will now be able to move forward with the eligibility letters that we have in queue. But, just to be fully transparent, most of the eligibility letters that we have in queue do not have the direct story component. So we're going to probably kick most of those back to the applicants, adding them to add that additional information, and that will take time.
Great. Thank you for that. So it looks like I think we had Tamara Kislak in the queue and then Paul Hansberry, and we might have had a little order issue here. So I'm going to go next to Tamara Kislak and then Paul Hansberry. Tamara, you should be able to unmute your device.
Here.
Question. Okay, great.
Okay, so thanks for acknowledging the trauma. I personally was held at gunpoint, arrested, held without my Miranda rights for significant times, and had many other complications for years beyond the many years before that the state of California and the county of Mendocino was taking DEA money to have Blackhawks come circle over our property for target practice. I put it all behind me. I went into this permitting process. I've been working within the confines of the bureaucracy set before me, the ever-changing limitations. And I didn't think about it. I just wanted to move forward. When this opportunity to get some of the money back that I had to pay back to Mendocino to get my farm equipment back and things like that came up, I thought, okay, maybe I'll relive this. Maybe I'll go through this. Maybe it'll be worth it. But it's been over a year now, and I have to deal with this trauma regularly because the process of getting this money has been so absurdly convoluted, delayed, and almost non-existent. I don't have much hope that I will ever get the money. So my question to you is, how can we make this more efficient? I've been in the process with my grant for over a year. The last communication that I had with Paula and her team was that I waited a month to hear that there was missing decimal places, a missing bullet point, and that they had mixed up one of the quotes. That seems like an inordinate amount of time. And I want to know, is there anything that you guys can do to help so we don't have to keep reliving this to make this more efficient?
All right, thank you for that. Paula, I think turn this one over to you, please.
Yes, no problem. Tamara, I'm very aware of your situation, and my apologies that there was a problem with your submission into Cobblestone, which has now been corrected. You know, Elevate has been working extremely hard to get folks through the process. And sometimes, you know, mistakes occur. You're not the only one who suffered from a mistake by the Elevate team. And we're all trying very hard and doing our very best. But at the same time, the amount of backlog and the amount of applications and the amount of work that my team has had to do to get folks through this process, the demand for the grant has been extremely high. We have been working not just with you, with multiple applicants, making multiple revisions and multiple changes and providing extreme amounts of feedback. So all I can say is I'm extremely sorry that a mistake was made with your application. It has now been corrected and you are moving forward.
Thank you for that, Paula. So we have 3 more folks in the queue. It is going to put us a little bit over time. Paula and Trish, can we stay to wrap up the last 3? Does that work? Okay. And then William, it'd be great if you can stay too, but I know you might have to jump off for other meetings. Okay, great. So I just want to let folks know that we're going to hear from Paul Hansberry, followed by Tom Perry, and then Michael Katz. And that's really going to be all we can manage during this meeting. So we'll now go to Paul Hansberry. You should be able to unmute your device, Paul, and start your question or your comment.
Yes, getting away from the criterion for the camp, which you can be directly impacted even if it wasn't a camp, if it was a comment raid or if it was a sheriff's raid. And if your story can demonstrate that, it shouldn't necessarily have to be a camp raid. But the application is also a point system. And I realized that on your points in the last application, there was no points given for a technical support. And I'm wondering if you established one of your planners to sit down and be able to talk and go over and review and help someone with their application so that it didn't have to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth for little minutia things. If they could just sit down for an hour and help them make sure that all the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted and things were applicable. And if they said things in terms that would be understood by the reviewers, you know, these people are farmers and are not necessarily creative writers or bureaucrats. So to assist them with the applications, not only for the LEAP program, but also for the applications for the permit, it might go a long way and you'd get extra points in your application for having a technical assistance program, which doesn't exist in Mendocino County right now. Just a couple of thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that. We can certainly bring that question forward. But I don't have an answer for it without actually asking the state if they feel that what your suggestion was, Paul, would qualify for a technical assistance program. I do know that we asked about whether or not technical assistance monies could be utilized by eligible applicants to provide assistance to prepare LJAGP grant applications, and the answer to that was no. So there are some pretty rigorous parameters around the technical assistance components, but we can definitely ask about working with planning staff on your application for cultivation or nursery operation, et cetera, and whether or not technical assistance could be awarded to applicants for assistance in developing their LEAP grant applications. So we will definitely ask those questions. Next, we're going to go to Thomas Perry, followed by Michael Katz. Thomas, you should be able to go ahead and unmute your device and start your question or your comment.
Hi, thanks. I'm really just trying to figure out, is there a way that we can get more detailed feedback on where we are within Cobblestone, and if there are issues, can we get those surfaced so we can hopefully adhere to what was the represented timeline for the process? My example is that I was in Cobblestone for something like 4 months and really had to push hard to get some feedback from the cannabis program that, we needed to make some corrections. That information wasn't really forthcoming. And we've made those corrections. I believe that we're in Cobblestone now, but there's not really any way for me to understand sort of where we are. And because it's a multi-step approval process, I'm sort of, in the situation again where like I'm wondering, okay, is there something wrong? Where are we? Has anybody signed off? So that's that's really where I am. Hoping that we can get some feedback so we can move things along expeditiously and correct problems if they're coming up.
All right, thank you for that. So we do meet, department staff meets with the Elevate Impact team on a weekly basis. Part of that weekly meeting is a report out from department staff. Usually William spearheads the report out to Elevate Impact about where everyone is in the Cobblestone process. And Elevate Impact team keeps diligent dated notes. So if you do have these kind of questions, I do think the Elevate Impact team can provide you an update, but it's a weekly 7-day snapshot, so to speak. Most recently, I think it's worth noting that the contracting department in the county has requested some formatting updates, which that memo or that information did not trickle down to our department staff until folks got all the way through to the very last review in Cobblestone. And then the requested formatting edits meant that William had to then extract the information from Cobblestone, conduct the formatting edits, which were not immediately made clear to our department staff. So we had to have some back and forth about how to format in alignment with what they were asking for and get clarity on what contracting unit was asking for. We do feel like we now have that clarity, but the lack of clarity did put Cobblestone reviews on hold for a number of weeks while we were wanting to ensure that we knew how to get through that final QC component, quality control component with the contracting department or unit. So I think, Thomas, if you want an update about where you are in Cobblestone, I'm sure we could provide that to you if you'd just be so kind as to email the Elevate team and cannabis grants at mendocinocounty.org. We can get you an update. But I have not heard a request for any additional information to be provided for your application specifically. So, but please send an email and we'll provide you an update. Okay, our last speaker today is going to be Michael Katz. Michael, you should be able to go ahead and unmute your device and ask your question or your comment.
Yes, thanks so much for the meeting and the opportunity to speak going over. I'd just like to say that it would have been useful going into the scheduling of this meeting. Obviously, it was kind of rescheduled at the very last minute. It's certainly hard for people who are scheduling things far out in advance to make accommodations. And I'm sure that folks will be able to see the recording, but if we could have more advance notice in the future, that would be great. Related to the comment that you just made about these weekly snapshots that are provided between the department and Elevate, it would be just, great if maybe those were shared with the applicants, because my understanding is that people are not being informed where they are in the process, as Tom indicated. And, rather than have everyone have to send an email saying, hey, where am I all these times and not hear back, maybe just provide that information upfront. Along those lines, it would be great if the department could share the assessment that went to the state about the equity program. I don't know if that information has been made available publicly. That would be super helpful. We'd love to see that. The equity regarding people's stories, I remember that the equity assessment, which is how we got the equity funds in the first place, it's filled with people's stories. I don't know if William has had a chance to review that, but that really talks about the paramilitary activity and the reason that Mendocino was provided with these grant funds in the first place. So I recommend taking a look at that. And I also shared back to William and you, Director Nevedal, and reshared actually to the Elevate team the recommendations that MCA had made in summer of 2020 about a points-based system for the equity program that was said, oh, well, we'll just get to it later. But now understanding that the foundational issue of the program is keeping us from getting additional funding, it seems that those recommendations should be reevaluated immediately. Thank you very much.
Okay, so what we can do is we can go ahead and we can post the assessment to the equity page. It is, as I mentioned, attached to the board agenda item for the solicitation packet. So you can look at the board agenda and the GGC agenda where this solicitation, the fourth round of funding solicitation, was discussed in those chambers, and find not only the grant application, but also the full assessment. But again, we can also link the assessment to the cannabis grants page in the local equity entrepreneur program section. Thank you for the suggestion about a point system. We've got some time to work through how to improve our criteria and the program. And I think considering a point system makes sense, but we will have more conversation with the public through these meetings as we move forward with reviewing and working with the state to enrich and create a more approved or a more appropriate criteria. So I don't have anything else to add at this moment. I'm wondering if William or Paula, you have any closing comments or anything you'd like to add?
Not necessarily.
Thank you.
Not necessarily closing, but directly to Michael's point, the equity assessment is a required part of the submission, and it was submitted. Absolutely.
So,
I just want to thank you, Kristen, and thank everybody for participating in this call. Obviously, there are a lot of improvements that can be made to the program, and I look forward to working with the community to implement that before our next application in October.
Thank you so much. All right. With that said, I think we're going to go ahead and end our webinar. Thanks for staying over 10 minutes to all of our staff and our contract administrator and members of the public who joined us. So until next time, thank you so much.